Hi, I'm stuck here at the practice for a few days. The snow's coming in, the storms are meeting, and I'm staying here enjoying the sceneries and writing a little bit and maybe doing a couple of podcasts. Anyways, I wanted to continue talking about the senses. I mean, the reason why I'm doing it is I've just recently, actually about 10 days ago, was lecturing to a group of postgraduate osteopaths in Tuscany about the senses, the neurodevelopment of the senses, and treating issues which are surrounded by the senses. Is a fascinating subject for me because I have an interest in Taoism, and I have quite a few chapters in my book that I'm writing actually right now that are about developing, expanding our sensory awareness and repatterning our senses so that our senses are patterned from day one, from the first minute we are in existence, meaning that every sensual experience that we get, an emotion is put onto it, and in some ways a judgment, and we develop all of our senses in a discerning manner, so that actually it's very hard for us to have a new sensory experience, especially through our five senses. And I've talked a little bit about smell, and I've talked a little bit about taste, and I'm going to talk a little bit about hearing, and I want to talk about vision, and I'm going to talk last about touch, because that's it's an important one. It's the one I use as an osteopath, and also I'm going to talk about this idea of the felt sense, which is more of a sensory feeling experience, which I use when I'm teaching development of sensory awareness, which I do. So, sound. Sound is really our interpretation of rushing and withdrawing wave of air molecules. It kind of begins with a motion. Something has to move. For example, a tractor or a bird's wings. They shake up the air molecules around it. This excites them and moves them. So from stillness there is movement. And so this creates a wave. And this wave, this sound wave, rolls almost like a tide to our ears. Now, sound is transmitted in three stages. The outer ear, which has its funny and very interesting shape. It's a very interesting developmental process that creates the pinna of the ear, of 6 different parts that kind of come together in this beautiful kind of fluid movement. The outer ear acts like a funnel, but the interesting thing about that is it's not actually necessary, because we can hear without the pinna of the ear and the outer ear. So, from the funnel, the sound is funneled in, and it hits this fan-like tympanic membrane, which is the eardrum. Passes through, moves this eardrum, which is obviously a problem in all these children we treat with chronic serous otitis media, glue ear, etc. And I'm going to do a whole different podcast on the management of glue ear. It's quite important in when you're treating children. So this membrane moves these 3 tiny bones, the smallest bones in the body, called the ossicles. The malleus, which is like a hammer, and the head of that fits into this cup-like socket called the incies, which then moves the third bone, which is the stapes, which presses like a piston against this little oval window. So it goes from air, it goes through a membrane, it hits these 3 little bones, which actually what they do, because we've got these 3 different movements that happen, and the movement gets transmitted to this little window and then pushes against this soft, fluid-filled inner ear. So by the time they reach this little oval window, the sound waves have been amplified by about 10 times. Now, so what we've gone is gone from an air environment to a structural, bony environment to a fluid environment. And this is all around vibration. Now, there's another little window further down called the round window. And this lies kind of below and behind the oval window. And this vibrates in the opposite phase to the vibrations through the oval window. And that opens directly into the cochlea, which is this kind of spiral bone fluid structure which processes hearing. So what happens is we've got a fluid environment. So as the oval window is displaced inwards, the round window moves outwards, which allows this movement of fluid within this shell-shaped cochlea. If the round window wasn't there, what would happen is you would push at this uncompressible fluid against the walls of the cochlea, which would not allow movement, so actually you wouldn't get any hearing. So you've got this inner ear now. So it's been translated through the middle ear into this fluid labyrinth of the inner ear. And this ear has this fluid compartment, very beautiful if you look at one, which has all these hairs in them, these tiny, tiny hairs. So what happens is this vibrational movement is transmitted through the fluid, which moves the fluid, which actually moves these little tiny hair cells, about a billionth of an inch or something, and that they open them up. They literally move this tiny movement, and then they allow some sort of charged ions to push through the pores, which change this create an electric potential movement, which is transferred along the cochlear nerve into the brain. So you've got this wonderful kind of structural air wave that goes transmitted into a fluid wave that actually gets transmitted into an electrical wave, which is processed by the brain. It's slightly more complex than that, but I'm giving you a simpler kind of view. These cochlear tubes grow by coiling within themselves, and actually by 11 weeks old, which is very early on in a fetus life, they're fully formed and coiled. By about 15 weeks old, which is quite young again, all of the 16,000 hair cells in each cochlea are matured. So you've got all these hairs pretty early on, actually, which is quite amazing, because babies actually start hearing at about 28 weeks in utero. And the first thing they can discriminate, of course, is their mother's voice, the sound of their mother's voice. Hearing develops very, very early, but it also develops very slowly, because the quality of hearing evolves very slowly. But fetuses as early as 23 weeks respond to sound stimuli, and by the third trimester, they really can discriminate different sounds. Obviously, they hear the mother first, the heartbeat, their voice, and other voices from outside they respond to. Older fetuses can discriminate between differing sounds, like a ba versus a b, or an e versus an r. This prenatal hearing plays a really important role in later language development. Hearing and language are very, very important. But as the first sounds that we hear is mother's voice and heartbeat, it contains a deep emotional connection. Certain musics, certain rhythms of heartbeats that are similar to mother's heartbeat. For example, like iambic pentameter, which is a form of poetry which goes ba-boom, 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 like a heartbeat. And certain types of musics which have the same tempo as the heart deeply calm us. And this is probably from our in utero life, when certain things have some effect. Father's voice has the deeper resonance is connected to security. But actually, these tiny little hair cells are incredibly sensitive, and actually they're very sensitive to hearing loss because they can be damaged just after their formation. This is really important because in one of my pet subjects I love to talk about is the care of premature babies. But actually, in certain environments where preemie babies have noisy incubators and they see these alarms that go off the whole time, it can really damage the very sensitive development of hearing. Anyway, another subject we'll talk about another time. Let's see, what else do you want to talk? Yes, before a baby is born, they're actually hearing in fluid. There's no air. You've got this mucus plug and this fluid. So actually, when a newborn is born, hearing becomes much clearer. So it's not muffled because you've got air going into fluid as opposed to fluid going into fluid. Very kind of natural development. So it's interesting that the threshold of hearing slowly improves until puberty and then goes down again. So a teenager's hearing is more acute than an adult's, which is very interesting because they like to have their music incredibly loud, but actually they're actually much more sensitive to hearing than we are, teenagers. We don't hear low frequencies well. For example, the deep resonant sounds of our bodies, we tune them out. And we also don't, as humans, hear very high-pitched sounds. And as we age, our eardrum actually thickens, and we lose the higher and lower levels, the pitch. An interesting thing that I was talking about was Helen Keller, the famous writer who was both deaf and dumb. And she would talk about, she had this incredible, very wonderful to read her books because she describes the senses unlike anyone, an incredibly developed sensory awareness because actually she was blind and deaf, but so she could actually, her sensory awareness was much, much stronger. Now, the interesting thing that she lost her hearing and vision at about 19 months old from a possible scarlet fever or meningitis. She always said in her writings that actually the loss of hearing was worse than the loss of vision. Now, it's an interesting question I pose to these students. What would you prefer? And it's very hard because we have them both. It's one to think about anyway. So, it's been shown that a variety in language and exposure to lots of natural sounds and music do affect the synaptic shaping of later hearing. But plasticity, which means the remolding and reshaping of the synaptic function, is still available to you about 7 to 8 years old. But it's very important too for language development, and we see this a lot of the children with glue ear, that especially, for example, children with Down syndrome, where it's very hard to decipher whether the blocked ears and the lack of hearing are causing the slowness in language development, or is it a neurodevelopmental issue? Often it's a little bit of both. But it's very important to get the ears functioning because actually it's all about the development of language. Language and hearing are so completely connected. So hearing, because of its location in the brain, the temporals, lobes, the auditory cortex, it's very connected to cognitive and emotional development. The interesting question is, do we actually hear with our ears stroke brain, or do we respond to the sound waves that are affected in different parts of our body? For example, the om sound in meditation seems to resonate with the heart. It's very interesting. So do we hear with our whole bodies, or do we just hear with our ears? And the other thing that I like to talk about a lot and write about is the idea that stillness has a sound. The quality of stillness has a sound. It's a kind of quiet, low-level, somewhere between a quiet. It's not a hiss. It's lower than that. It's a quality. It's like a boom. It's a very quiet. Maybe it's the sound. People say it's the sound of the universe, but just try and get a sense of that. If you're in a very still place, get a sense of the sound, the presence in stillness. Anyway, I'll come back to that with my work on the Dynamics of Stillness book. Okay, that's hearing, and we'll come back with the next two.